I'm Lena Hartley, 33 years old, and for most of my life, I believed keeping the peace was the same as keeping a family together. That Monday evening, as I pulled into my parking space after another long day at the office, my phone buzzed with a message from my father telling me we needed to talk as a family on Sunday. The words sat heavy in my chest, stripped of warmth, as if the decision had already been made without me. I knew the tone well. Ryan must have fallen into something again, something expensive. By the end of that week, those few clipped sentences would mark the end of the daughter they used to depend on. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to carry more than anyone ever noticed. I grew up in a modest Midwestern town where people prided themselves on doing right by each other, even when it stretched them thin. My parents raised my brother and me to value hard work and kindness, and I took those lessons to heart from the beginning. My mother always said I came into the world serious and ready to help, and maybe that was true. I was the child who smoothed over arguments, the one who offered to tidy up after dinner, the one who learned early that being reliable made life easier for everyone else. My father worked long shifts at a manufacturing plant and often carried tension home with him, but he softened when I brought home straight A's or sat beside him during old Western movies. Money was tight, and though they tried to shield us from it, I learned to read worry in the hushed conversations behind closed doors. When I left for college on a scholarship, it felt like stepping into a world that didn't quite match the one I came from. My classmates took spring breaks abroad while I stayed on campus working extra hours. They talked about inheritances and trust funds while I learned to stretch $20 for a week. Yet I never resented any of it. I simply believed that if I worked hard enough, I could build something steady and safe, something my parents would be proud of. After graduation, I moved a few hours away for my first real job, grateful for the chance to start building a life on my own terms. I didn't realize then how quickly my family would lean on that new stability, or how quietly my boundaries would dissolve under the weight of their expectations. Over the years, I became the one they called for every crisis. Medical bills, car repairs, rent shortages, missed deadlines. What began as small favors turned into regular transfers, quiet rescues, and the unspoken assumption that I would always catch whatever was falling. My mother would say, "You're so good with this stuff, honey," as if competence meant obligation. My father rarely asked. He simply informed me when Ryan needed help, his voice flat, sure of my compliance. And Ryan, with his impulsive job changes and grand ideas that never quite turned into anything, treated my support as if it were just part of the family routine. For a long time, I didn't question it. I told myself that families helped one another, that I could handle it, that things would balance out eventually. But as I settled into my 30s, climbed each rung at work, and began truly noticing how no one ever asked if I was managing something inside me shifted. I stopped offering information about my promotions, stopped mentioning the bonuses I earned, stopped trying to prove my worth. I learned to recognize the sharp edge in my father's voice when he spoke about my success, half pride, half expectation. I saw the relief in my mother's eyes when I walked through their door, as if my presence alone meant she could exhale. Still, I believed that if I stayed steady, stayed patient, stayed, good things would eventually ease. I wanted to believe their love wasn't tied to my usefulness. But the unease that crept into my stomach when I saw my father's name flash across my phone told a different story, one I wasn't ready to name yet. That Sunday meeting request felt different. Too formal, too rehearsed. My family didn't hold meetings. They dropped problems into my lap and waited for me to solve them. And as I stood in my kitchen rereading that message, under the dim evening light, I knew something larger was coming, something that would finally show me what role I truly played in their lives. I didn't know yet what they would ask, only that when they spoke, I would finally hear them clearly. And once I did, nothing would ever go back to the way it was. The Sunday meeting crept up on me faster than I expected. I spent most of that morning moving slowly around my apartment, setting down my coffee on the counter, forgetting it, then picking it up again. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual. The neighborhood looked the same as always, the trimmed hedges, the quiet sidewalks, the familiar mailbox, leaning a little to one side. Yet something about it felt different to me, as if the air around those streets already knew what was waiting inside the house before I did. When I parked in the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment and let my hands rest on the steering wheel, steadying my breath before walking up the steps. My mother opened the door before I reached it, as if she had been listening for my footsteps. She smiled quickly and ushered me inside, but her eyes moved too fast, skimming over me then toward the dining room. My father stood near the end of the table, with his arms folded, wearing the same worn flannel shirt I remembered from my childhood. Ryan was already seated, leaning back in his chair, one leg bouncing beneath the table. The room smelled faintly of roast chicken, but the air felt tight, like the walls had shifted closer together. No one said anything for a moment, as if waiting for someone else to make the first move. We sat through dinner without much conversation, though my mother tried to fill the silence with mentions of neighbors and grocery sales. I listened, nodded when appropriate, and let my gaze drift to the window, watching the dim light settle over the backyard. My father didn't touch most of his meal. Ryan scrolled through his phone between bites. It felt like each of us was holding our breath, waiting for the moment someone would finally rip the cover off whatever this family meeting was meant to be. When the plates were cleared, my father let out a slow breath, pushed back his chair, and leaned forward as if starting a rehearsed speech. "Lena," he set his tone, "even your brothers run into a difficult situation." He paused there, letting the words hang in the air while my mother folded her hands on the table as though bracing herself. Ryan shifted his expression tight, but strangely expectant. My father continued with careful, measured phrases. Some mistakes, a misunderstanding, legal trouble, each one placed like a tile on a floor he hoped I wouldn't examine too closely. Then he finally said the number 210,000. Ryan didn't flinch. He looked up from his phone long enough to add, "I've got 30 days before things get serious." His voice was flat, almost casual, like he was mentioning a bill that came in higher than expected. My mother quickly stepped in, saying they had talked it over and believed the best course of action would be for me to help just until Ryan gets back on his feet. Her voice wavered slightly on the last words, but she kept her smile steady. My father leaned back as though the decision was settled. "She'll pay everything," he said. "Not could, not should. Will." The words landed without hesitation, without even the courtesy of looking in my direction. He might as well have been discussing paperwork or a household chore. No one asked if I was able to do it. No one asked what I thought. Their quiet certainty filled the room, leaving no space for anything else. For a moment, no one moved. The house was silent, except for the ticking clock near the doorway. My mother's eyes were on her lap. Ryan glanced at the ceiling. My father remained still, waiting for a response he believed was already guaranteed. I looked at each of them, taking in the scene like a photograph I'd never fully understood until now. The expectation on their faces was familiar, but something in me shifted as I saw it clearly for the first time. This wasn't a request. It wasn't even a conversation. It was a decision they had made long before I walked through the door. I stood up slowly, letting my chair slide back across the floor. I didn't raise my voice or ask for an explanation. I didn't list the bills I'd paid over the years, or remind them of how many times I'd stepped in without being asked. I simply smoothed my coat, walked toward the door, and opened it. My mother called my name. Her voice filled with surprise that didn't quite reach panic. She stood halfway out of her chair, unsure whether to follow me. My father shifted, confused, but not alarmed, as if he thought I was stepping outside for a moment before returning to agree. Ryan stared at the table. I didn't turn around. I didn't explain. I closed the door behind me quietly and walked to my car. The air outside felt cool as it brushed against my face, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. I unlocked my car and got in the steering wheel, warm from the sun earlier that day. When I started the engine, the hum of it filled the silence I'd carried from the house. I backed out of the driveway and turned onto the main road without looking back at the windows behind me. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove across town, letting the roads lead me, while my thoughts settled into something clear and steady. The lights from passing cars flickered across my dashboard, soft and rhythmic. I didn't feel angry, and I didn't feel confused. The wait I had expected never came. I stopped at a quiet lot overlooking a small field, turned off the engine, and rested my hands on my lap. The world outside felt still. My phone buzzed after a few minutes. A message from my mother asking where I went. Another from my father saying we needed to finish the conversation. A short one from Ryan, surprised I had left without saying anything. I set the phone face down on the seat beside me and let the messages fade into the background. The house I'd grown up in had always felt familiar, but that night sitting alone in my car, I realized something important had shifted long before I walked out the door. I didn't think about what came next in any detailed way. I only knew that stepping back inside and agreeing would undo something I couldn't piece together again. The decision they had made for me was clear. The one I made for myself was even clearer. As the sky darkened and the field settled into its quiet shape, I started the car again, ready to drive toward the next place that felt steady. I didn't know then that this moment was only the beginning, or how quickly everything would unravel after I refused to play the role they'd written for me. But I sensed it faintly in the calm that washed over me as I pulled back onto the road. A line had been crossed, and nothing would return to the way it had been. I drove toward the city lights ahead, not knowing what waited for me in the days to come, only that something had shifted permanently, and the next turn in the road would bring the fallout I could already feel gathering in the distance. The drive back to my apartment after leaving my parents' house was quiet, the kind of quiet that stays with you long after the engine stops. I parked in my usual spot, turned off the headlights, and sat for a moment before heading upstairs. The hallway lights hummed faintly as I slipped my key into the lock, stepped inside, and closed the door behind me. The space was familiar soft lamp in the corner, the coat I'd left on the chair that morning, the faint scent of brewed coffee lingering from earlier, but something about it felt distant, as if I was walking into someone else's home instead of my own. I set my purse on the counter and stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet settle around me. My phone buzzed on and off with new messages, but I didn't pick it up. I walked to the sink, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter while the refrigerator hummed softly behind me. The messages kept coming one after another, filling the room with small bursts of light from the screen. I let them pass without opening a single one. Later, I changed into a pair of old sweatpants and sat on the edge of my bed. The bedside clock cast a faint glow across the comforter. I could still picture the scene from earlier, the dining room, the stillness after my father spoke, the way no one had looked at me when they decided what I would do. The memory played out with a kind of clarity I couldn't push away. I lay back on the pillows and focused on the ceiling, the quiet around me deepening until it felt almost heavy. The next morning came early. I got ready for work as I always did, methodical and steady, though I moved a little slower as I brushed my hair and chose a sweater. When I reached my office building, the glass doors reflected the soft winter light, and I slipped inside with the first wave of early arrivals. My desk was the same as always, the monitor waiting the small plant I tended each week leaning toward the window. I turned on my computer, opened the first spreadsheet, and tried to settle into the rhythm of the day. But it wasn't a normal morning. I found my mind drifting back to the night before, to the look on my father's face when he said I would pay everything, to the silence that followed. By midday, I realized I had reread the same line in a report several times without taking in a word of it. I closed the document and took a slow breath, letting it out as I looked out the window at the street below. People hurried along the sidewalks, absorbed in their own routines, unaware that anything was different. During lunch, I sat at a small table near the back of the cafe I usually visited. The room was filled with quiet chatter and the soft clink of dishes. I wrapped my hands around a warm cup of soup and listened to the gentle hum of voices. My phone vibrated again, and I turned it over to check the screen. It was a message from my father, short and direct, followed by one from Ryan that was longer, crowded with words I didn't open. I set the phone face down again and pushed my soup aside. When I returned home that evening, the apartment felt cooler than usual. I adjusted the thermostat and turned on the lamp in the living room. I moved around the space slowly, almost cautiously, as if something delicate might shatter if I wasn't careful. I sat on the couch and folded my hands in my lap, letting the quiet settle around me once more. The day had worn on me in a way I hadn't expected. Even small tasks felt heavier, as if each one required more effort than before. The messages from my family continued through the night, questions at first, then impatience, then confusion. They came in a steady stream, their words filling the screen with a kind of urgency that didn't match the stillness in my apartment. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I stood by the window watching the streetlights cast their glow across the pavement. I went to bed early but woke several times during the night. Each time I opened my eyes, the room was dim and still, the glow from the clock marking the hours as they passed. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars on the main road. The quiet felt different now. It wasn't comforting, and it wasn't unsettling. It simply existed, and I rested inside it. The next few days passed in a muted rhythm. I worked, went home, made simple dinners, and tried to keep my thoughts steady. My parents reached out several times, each message clipped and increasingly strained. Ryan called a few times too, though I let the calls go to voicemail. Throughout the week, I found myself moving through each day with careful steps, as though balancing something fragile. On Friday, I arrived home just as the sun began to set. I placed my keys on the table and turned on the living room lamp. My phone buzzed again, and I reached for it without thinking. It was Ryan this time, his name glowing on the screen. I hesitated, unsure whether to answer, then set the phone back down as the call went to voicemail. I walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle for tea. The water began to warm, a soft rumble growing beneath the metal. I leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn in just a little, but I stayed where I was, letting the quiet settle in once again. That night, as I sat on the couch with a blanket across my lap, a new thought surfaced, gentle, steady, and certain. Something had shifted inside me when I walked out of my parents' house. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, but unmistakable. And I knew it was leading me somewhere I hadn't been before, towards something I wasn't ready to name yet. Still, the feeling stayed with me as the evening deepened, and I realized it would follow me into the days ahead. The strain with my family hadn't eased, and the messages hadn't stopped, but something in me had started to settle into place. I didn't know what came next, or how long these quiet days would last, but I felt the weight of something approaching, something waiting just out of sight. As I turned off the lamp and headed toward my bedroom, I sensed that whatever was coming would bring the shift I had felt from the moment I walked out that door. And I knew even then that the next time my phone rang, it wouldn't be asking a question, it would be demanding an answer I wasn't willing to give. The days that followed settled into a pattern that felt both familiar and strangely unsteady. I went to work, finished my tasks, and returned home each night to the same quiet apartment, yet something inside me stayed alert, as if waiting for a signal I couldn't name. I kept my phone on silent more often than not, letting the messages from my family collect without opening them. Their words filled the screen in neat lines, but I didn't tap a single one. Instead, I moved through each day with measured steps, keeping my mind focused on the present moment. One evening after work, I paused by the door of my apartment before turning the key. The hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of the building's heating system. When I stepped inside, the room felt cool, as though the air had settled in my absence. I set my bag on the counter and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights glowed against the dusky sky, their reflections stretching across the pavement. I watched them flicker softly and felt something settle in me. A quiet understanding was forming, though it hadn't yet taken shape. I spent that night sorting through old papers, receipts, and documents I hadn't reviewed in years. I sat on the floor with everything spread out around me, the soft light from the lamp casting shadows along the carpet. I sifted through file folders, reading each line carefully, letting the pieces of my past support fall into place before me. Cable bills, old payments, medical costs, small deposits I'd made into my parents' account. Each paper carried a memory I had tucked away to keep the peace. I didn't linger on them. I simply set them in a pile on my right and continued. After an hour, I reached for the binder I kept hidden behind a stack of cleaning supplies under the sink. The cover was plain, but inside it held years of records, bank transfers, statements, and notes about each time I stepped in to help. I placed the binder on the table and opened it, slowly flipping through page after page. The numbers spoke plainly, each one a quiet marker in a long trail of support I had offered without question. I sat back and let the pages rest open, feeling the weight of everything I had carried alone. The next morning, as I prepared for work, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen but didn't reach for it. Instead, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. The drive to the office felt steady, and the usual morning rush gathered around me as I walked through the glass doors. I settled into my desk and began my day, but my thoughts drifted back to the binder and the quiet clarity I had felt while flipping through its pages. Around lunchtime, I stepped outside for some air. A gentle breeze moved down the street carrying the scent of early spring. I walked slowly to a bench near the entrance and sat down watching people pass by with coffees in hand. My phone buzzed again, and this time I felt a nudge inside me, something quiet but certain. I reached into my bag, pulled out the phone, and opened the newest message. It was from my father. "Call us tonight. We need to revisit the issue." Something in me shifted. The steady silence I had held began to take shape into something clearer, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't respond. I put the phone away, stood up, and walked back inside the building with a new steadiness in my steps. Later that evening, after I returned home, I sat on the couch with the binder open beside me. The apartment was still the lamp casting a soft glow across the room. I looked over the pages once more before opening my laptop. I pulled up an email draft I had started weeks earlier but never sent. It contained the contact information for an attorney a former manager had recommended to me during a casual conversation. I hesitated only for a moment before adding a few attachments. The binder scans the records and a brief note. Then I hit send. The reply came within minutes. A request for a call. I stared at the screen for a heartbeat before picking up my phone and dialing the number. When the call connected, a calm voice introduced herself as Carol Kim. She asked a few questions, her tone even and straightforward, and I answered each one carefully, keeping my voice steady. As I spoke, I realized how much I had been holding back these past weeks, and each word brought a little more clarity into the room. After reviewing everything, Carol paused for a moment before saying, "They don't have a case. There's nothing indicating these were loans, no terms, no agreements, nothing that legally obligates you." Her voice was steady, professional, and sure. "If they pursue this further, we can respond. You have options." Her certainty steadied something in me. I thanked her for her time, and we agreed to speak again if anything new developed. When I hung up, the room felt different, as if it had grown larger somehow. I sat still for a moment before closing the binder and placing it on the coffee table. Over the next few days, I moved through my routines with a newfound awareness. My family continued sending messages, alternating between clipped reminders and strained attempts to appear calm. I answered none of them. When Ryan called late one evening, I watched the screen light up in the darkened room before letting the call fade to voicemail. I didn't feel the pull to respond anymore. The silence between us felt like a place I could breathe. One afternoon after work, I stopped at a cafe I didn't usually visit. The room was warm, filled with the soft aroma of baked bread and quiet conversation. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched people pass along the sidewalk. As I sipped the tea, a thought rose gently within me. It was clear, steady, and certain. Something had shifted permanently when I walked out of my parents' house. Before that night, I had moved through my life with the assumption that I needed to keep things balanced, that it was my responsibility to absorb what others couldn't carry. Now I understood with a quiet certainty that I didn't have to step back into that role again. Later that evening, I returned home and placed the binder back under the sink, not to hide it, but simply to put it away. I walked through each room, turning off lights and straightening small things as I went. The apartment felt steady again, grounded in a way I hadn't noticed before. When I finally sat down on the couch, a light breeze drifted in through the small opening in the window. I leaned back and let the room settle around me, feeling the gentle shift that had been building over the past days. I didn't know what would come next, but I sensed it approaching a turning point that would bring everything into focus. I reached over and turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into a soft dimness. Tomorrow, something new would arrive, something I had already begun preparing myself to face. And as I settled into the quiet of the evening, I knew I was ready for it. The morning after my call with Carol, I woke before sunrise, the room still dim and quiet. I lay still for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the heat turning on before sitting up and swinging my legs over the side of the bed. My feet touched the cool hardwood floor, and something in that small sensation felt grounding. I stood, wrapped a robe around myself, and walked to the kitchen. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten soft blue, brushing the horizon, and I made a cup of tea while the apartment slowly warmed around me. As I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the mug, I felt a steady calm settle in. The call with Carol had clarified things I had been trying to ignore for years, and though I didn't have a full plan yet, something inside had shifted from waiting to acting. When I finished my tea, I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room, turned on the lamp, and pulled out a legal pad. I wrote down a list, line by line, bank accounts, passwords, recurring payments, anything connected to my family that needed to be reviewed. I didn't rush. I worked through each item with quiet focus, stopping only when the first rays of sunlight touched the edge of the desk. I spent the next several evenings doing the same thing. After work, I would come home, set my bag on the counter, and return to the list. I changed passwords, removed my information from old accounts, and reviewed records I hadn't looked at in months. Each task took time, but none of them felt overwhelming. It was as though I was sorting through a drawer that had been cluttered for years, placing each thing in its proper place with careful hands. I didn't speak to my parents or reply to Ryan, though their messages continued in steady waves. I let each one arrive without responding. One evening, while I was reviewing my financial statements, my phone rang. Ryan's name appeared on the screen again. I watched the call come through, then fade as voicemail picked it up. A moment later, the notification for a new message appeared. I didn't open it. Instead, I closed the laptop, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. The lights along the sidewalk glowed softly, and a few people walked past with grocery bags or dogs in tow. I watched them for a moment before drawing the curtains partway closed. The next day at work, I moved through my tasks with deliberate focus. The office was quiet that morning, with only the soft clicking of keyboards and the murmur of small conversations floating across the room. I reviewed reports, answered emails, and attended meetings, but a part of my mind remained fixed on the steps I still had to take at home. During lunch, I walked to a nearby cafe and sat in a corner booth with a salad and a notebook. I wrote down a few more tasks, then closed the notebook and returned to work. When I got home later that evening, the sun had already begun to set, casting long shadows through the apartment. I turned on the lamp in the living room and placed my keys in their usual spot. I walked to the bedroom and began pulling a few things from the closet: jeans, sweaters, a pair of comfortable shoes. I folded them neatly and placed them in a small suitcase. I didn't need much, just enough to get me through the first few weeks in a new place. I had already signed a short-term lease on a small loft across the state line. It wasn't far, but it was far enough. Far enough that they wouldn't drop by unannounced, far enough that the address wouldn't appear on old forms or shared accounts. I packed slowly, working through each drawer with calm hands. The suitcase filled quickly, and when I zipped it closed, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. The next morning, I requested a few days off from work, using vacation time I had saved over the years. My manager approved the request without hesitation, and I spent the following evenings packing the rest of my essentials: 2 boxes of books, a few dishes, and personal items I wanted to keep. Everything else I left as it was. I placed a stack of items near the door to donate, and another for recycling. The apartment grew emptier each day, the echo in the rooms growing more noticeable as I carried boxes to my car. One night, as I was clearing out the last cabinet in the living room, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was a call from my mother. Her name lit up the dark screen, the glow reflecting against the now bare wall. I let it ring until it stopped. A moment later, a message appeared, short, uncertain, and without the urgency of previous ones. I set the phone aside and continued packing. I drove to the new loft on a Saturday morning. The highway stretched long and open ahead of me, and the drive passed quietly. The loft was small, clean, and bright, with tall windows and light-colored floors. When I unlocked the door for the first time, the room felt still and untouched. I placed my suitcase inside, then returned to the car for the boxes. Within an hour, everything I had brought fit neatly along one wall. I spent the afternoon setting up the essentials. I placed a few books on the small shelf near the window and arranged my clothes in the closet. I made the bed with fresh sheets and plugged in a lamp beside it. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I sat on the edge of the bed and took a slow breath. The space felt new, but it didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt open, like a blank page waiting to be written on. That evening, I walked to a nearby grocery store and bought a few simple things: tea bread, soup, fruit. Back at the loft, I made a small meal and sat at the counter to eat. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. I washed the dishes when I was done, then sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the last bit of light fade from the sky. The next morning, I woke early to a faint glow through the curtains. I made tea and stood near the window, holding the warm mug between my hands. A soft breeze drifted in through the small opening at the top of the window, carrying the scent of salt from the nearby water. I watched the sun rise, slowly casting gentle light across the empty room. As I stood there, I realized I hadn't thought about my phone since I set it on the counter the night before. I walked over and turned it on. Several missed calls and messages filled the screen, a mix of numbers both familiar and unknown. I placed the phone face down again, then returned to the window with my tea. I knew the quiet wouldn't last. There were still things waiting to unfold, and I sensed the next shift approaching. But for the first time in a long while, I felt steady. I had taken the first steps away from the life that had held me in place for so long, and though I didn't know what would come next, I felt ready to meet it. The quiet in the loft held steady over the next few days. I settled into the new space, gradually arranging small things here and there, learning the rhythm of the street below, and waking each morning with the soft light filtering through the tall windows. I kept my phone on silent most of the time. The messages continued, though each day they seemed to arrive with less force, as if the urgency behind them was starting to thin. I didn't open them, and I didn't feel the familiar pull to respond. One Thursday afternoon, I left the co-working space where I'd been working remotely and walked down the sidewalk toward my car. The air carried a cool breeze from the water, and the street was filled with the steady hum of people heading home for the evening. I had just reached my car when I heard someone behind me call my name. I turned to see a man in a dark jacket walking toward me with a clipboard in one hand and an envelope in the other. "Are you Lena Hartley?" he asked. I nodded before I had time to think. He handed me the envelope, asked for a quick signature on the clipboard, and offered a polite, "Have a good evening," before turning away. The entire exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, yet the envelope in my hand felt heavier than its size suggested. I opened the car door, sat down, and rested the envelope on the passenger seat. For a moment, I simply stared at it before opening the flap. Inside was a formal civil complaint filed by my parents. The pages were crisp and filled with words I never imagined I would see attached to their names, claims that the money I had given them over the years had been loans, that I had made verbal promises to continue supporting them, that my recent withdrawal was causing them hardship. I read each line slowly, following the neat rows of text as if I were reviewing a document for work. When I finished, I placed the papers back in the envelope and sat quietly for a long moment. The car around me felt still. People moved on the sidewalk outside, talking, laughing, walking their dogs, unaware of the small shift taking place inside my parked car. I let the moment settle before turning the key in the ignition and heading back to the loft. When I walked inside, I set the envelope on the counter and took a slow breath. The loft felt steady as always, with its warm light and quiet walls. I reached for my laptop, opened it on the kitchen island, and drafted an email to Carol. I attached the scanned pages, added a brief note, and pressed send. Within minutes, my phone rang. Carol's voice came through calm and clear. She had reviewed the documents already and began walking me through each claim. "They don't have grounds for any of this," she said. "There are no written agreements, no terms, no evidence supporting their claims." Her tone was steady, as if guiding me through a routine assessment. "This is pressure, not legality. We'll file a response." I listened as she continued outlining next steps, each one delivered with measured confidence. When she paused, I asked quietly, "What happens now?" "Now," she said, "we put everything in writing, and you protect your peace." After we hung up, I placed the phone face down and walked to the window. Outside, the lights along the street glowed against the evening sky. I stood there for a few minutes, letting the stillness settle in. The envelope was still on the counter, its sharp corners catching the light. I walked back to it, placed it in a drawer, and closed it gently. The next morning, I woke early and made a cup of tea. I sat at the small table near the window, the steam rising softly as the sun began to brighten the room. The loft felt calm, untouched by the tension waiting in that drawer. I gathered my things and headed to the co-working space, ready for another day of work. That afternoon, just as I was packing up my laptop, my phone lit up with an incoming call from Ryan. I watched his name flash across the screen. The first call went unanswered, followed by another. When the third call came through, I picked up the phone and stepped outside to a quiet stretch of sidewalk. "Lena," he said, breathless as if he'd been pacing. "What is going on? Mom and Dad said you're ignoring everything. They said you hired an attorney. Are you really doing this?" I held the phone to my ear and listened as he continued. His voice was strained, edged with panic, and layered with something that sounded like disbelief. I didn't interrupt. I waited until he paused long enough for me to speak. "I'm taking care of myself," I said quietly. "You're going to let them file this. You're just going to, fight us. Is that it?" His words tumbled out quickly, each one pressing against the next. "You know what this means for me, right? I could lose everything. My apartment, my license, everything. You made choices," I said. "This is the result of those choices." He exhaled sharply, the sound catching as if he couldn't decide whether to argue or plead. "I'm your brother." "Yes," I said, "you are." The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear faint traffic in the background, the steady hum of the street around him. When he spoke again, his voice sounded thinner. "Please, Lena, I'm asking you. Just help me one last time." I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words settle before answering. "I can't do that." He let out a shaky breath, and for a moment I wondered if he might hang up. Instead, he said softly, "You used to care." I looked down at the sidewalk beneath my feet, then said, "I care enough to stop." The silence that followed stretched out quiet and steady. Then the line disconnected. I slipped the phone into my bag and walked back inside to gather my things. The co-working space felt bright, the soft clatter of keyboards filling the room in a steady rhythm. I closed my laptop and headed toward the door, feeling a calmness that surprised me. That evening, I drove back to the loft as the sun dipped low, casting warm light across the buildings. I carried my bag inside and placed it near the entryway. I warmed a bowl of soup, sat at the counter, and ate slowly. The room felt steady, grounded, as if holding me in place. Later, as I settled on the couch with a blanket draped across my legs, a feeling washed over me, quiet, clear, and certain. For years, I had moved through my life in reaction to the needs of others, adjusting myself to their demands without considering my own limits. But something had shifted now, something that could not unshift. The lawsuit, the calls, the pleas, they no longer held the same grip over me. I had stepped away, and the distance was beginning to show its shape. I turned off the lamp beside me, letting the room fall into a gentle dimness. The soft glow from the streetlights filtered through the curtains, casting faint patterns on the wall. As I prepared for bed, I sensed that the next days would bring resolution, maybe not the kind my family expected, but the kind that had been forming quietly since the night I walked out of their house. And as I lay beneath the covers, listening to the distant sound of the water and the steady hum of the loft, I knew the turning point had arrived. The shift was complete. The next part of this story would carry me in a new direction, one I was finally ready to follow. The morning after Ryan's call, I woke to a pale wash of sunlight stretching across the bedroom wall. For a moment I lay still and listened to the quiet inside the loft, the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from me. I reached for my phone, checked for new messages, and found only a few unread notifications. Nothing urgent, nothing different from the days before. I set the phone aside and got ready for work, taking my time as I moved through the small routines of the morning. At the co-working space, I settled into my desk and opened my laptop. The steady tap of keyboards filled the room around me, creating a soft rhythm that helped me focus. I reviewed a report, made a few notes, and felt myself slip back into a comfortable rhythm. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the weight of anything pressing against me. Around mid-morning, an email alert appeared on my screen. It was from Carol. She had filed the formal response. I read her message twice, letting the words settle. Her tone was calm as always, but there was a finality beneath it. She explained that the response outlined the lack of any agreements, documented the pattern of one-sided financial support, and rejected each claim with clarity. At the bottom of the message, she noted that we would wait for the next step, but she did not expect the case to continue. I thanked her and closed the email. The soft hum of the room returned to the forefront, and I took a slow breath, feeling something inside me loosen, just slightly. I finished my workday with steady focus, then packed up my things and headed to the loft. That evening, I made a small dinner pasta, a simple salad, and ate at the counter. The loft was warm from the afternoon sun, and the windows still held the last traces of sunset. After washing the dishes, I sat near the window with a cup of tea, watching people stroll down the sidewalk below. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting soft pools of light across the pavement. A soft vibration from my phone broke the quiet. I glanced at the screen and saw a new message from an unknown number. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something nudged me to open it. It was from Ryan. He said he had received notice of the formal response. The message was short, just a few sentences, but the tone was different from the ones before. There was no frustration, no urgency, no attempt to convince me of anything. Instead, there was a kind of quiet resignation. I didn't reply. I set the phone down and looked back out the window. The street had quieted, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of salt from the water. I wrapped my hands around the cup and took a small sip, letting the warmth spread through me. Later that night, I pulled an empty notebook from my bag and opened it on the kitchen table. The loft was quiet except for the soft hum from the refrigerator. I clicked a pen open and wrote a title across the first page, Second Ledger. I had been thinking about the name for weeks, though I hadn't written it down until that moment. I started outlining ideas, a small nonprofit focused on helping people quietly break free from families who treated them as providers rather than members. I wrote in short lines, each one grounded in things I had learned along the way: financial independence, emotional clarity, boundaries in practice. I didn't map out every detail. I just let the ideas fill the page. The notebook grew heavier with each line, not with burden, but with purpose. I wrote until the words naturally slowed. When I set the pen down, the room felt still and open, as if the walls themselves were listening. I closed the notebook gently and placed it in the drawer beside the sink. In the days that followed, my parents' case went silent. There were no new filings, no new accusations, and no attempt to contact me through other avenues. The stillness was noticeable. It settled into the spaces around me like a soft exhale. I continued working on my project in the evenings, shaping it slowly, letting it form at its own pace. Each step felt quiet, but sure. Toward the end of the week, I returned to the apartment building where I had once lived, just long enough to pick up a few remaining items I had left behind. The drive felt familiar at first, but as I pulled into the old parking lot, I realized it no longer carried the heaviness it once did. I walked up the steps and entered the nearly empty unit. The echo of my footsteps followed me through each room. Most of what I had owned was already gone, donated, recycled, or left neatly behind. I gathered the last box of books and a folded blanket, then walked slowly toward the door. Before leaving, I paused for a moment and looked around. The space felt hollow but peaceful, as if it held no lingering expectations. I locked the door behind me and returned the key to the office downstairs. When I arrived back at the loft, I placed the books on the shelf and folded the blanket at the end of the bed. The room felt full in a new way, not with things, but with a sense of direction. I took a slow breath and let the air settle around me. That evening, I received one last message from Ryan. This one was brief, just a single line thanking me for listening during his earlier calls, even though I hadn't given him what he asked for. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a plea. It was simply quiet. I read it once, then set the phone aside without replying. The loft was dim, except for the soft light from the lamp beside me. I pulled a blanket over my legs and let the quiet stretch through the room. The strain of the past weeks had settled into something solid and unmoving. I sensed the next chapter waiting just ahead, steady and open. As I turned off the lamp, I looked toward the window, where the moonlight cast a faint glow along the sill. The room felt calm, carrying the soft stillness of a place untouched by expectation. I lay back and let myself sink into the covers, knowing that the closing of one door had made room for something else entirely, something I was ready to reach for. Tomorrow, I knew the final shift would arrive, and this time it would come gently, without force, bringing a kind of closure I had not expected, but was more than ready to accept. A few mornings after Ryan's final message, I stepped onto the small balcony outside my loft with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft glow across the water in the distance, and the air felt cool and clean. I leaned against the railing and let the quiet settle around me. For the first time in a long while, there was no sense of waiting, no tension in my chest from a message I hadn't answered or a problem I hadn't solved. The quiet belonged to me now. Inside, my phone buzzed once on the counter, the sound faint through the open door. I finished my coffee before walking back inside to check it. A single notification blinked across the screen, an email I didn't recognize at first. When I opened it, I saw it was from my parents' attorney confirming that the case had been formally withdrawn. No explanation, no note, no attempt at a final word, just a statement of closure. I set the phone down gently and stood there for a moment, letting the meaning settle in. There would be no more filings, no more demands to provide support, no more accusations. The long thread of expectation that had tied me to their needs had finally snapped, not with noise or conflict, but with a quiet release. Later that afternoon, after finishing my work, I opened the notebook where I had started outlining ideas for Second Ledger. The pages were still sparse, but as I read through the notes, the purpose behind them grew steadier. I wrote a few more lines, small steps to begin registering the foundation, possible community partners, early outreach plans. I didn't try to finish everything at once. I just let the plan form slowly, one thought at a time. When I closed the notebook, I opened the window beside the desk to let in the cool evening breeze. The streets below were busy, with the late-day rhythm cars passing by people returning home, laughter drifting from a nearby patio. I listened for a while, letting the sounds blend together before returning to the kitchen to make dinner. A few days later, a handwritten envelope arrived in my mailbox. There was no return address, but I recognized my mother's handwriting instantly. I brought it inside and stood by the kitchen island before opening it. The note inside was short, written carefully, as though each word had been weighed before being placed on the page. She apologized for the choices they had made, for not seeing me beyond the help I offered, and for the weight they had placed on my shoulders without ever asking how I was managing. She ended with a few simple lines that reflected more understanding than anything I had heard from them in years. I read the note twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer beside the sink. I didn't reach for a pen, and I didn't think about what to write back. Some things didn't need immediate answers. Some things simply needed time. That evening, I sat near the window with a cup of tea and watched the sky turn a deep shade of blue. A few scattered clouds drifted overhead, lit softly by the setting sun. The loft carried a warmth that wasn't from any lamp or heater. It came from knowing I had made choices that protected my future, choices that allowed me to stand on steady ground without the weight of past expectations. As the last of the daylight faded, I walked out to the balcony again. The street below had quieted, and a calm breeze moved through the trees. I leaned against the railing and let my shoulders relax. The journey from that night at my parents' house to this moment had not been quick or simple, but standing there I could feel how far I had come. I had stepped away from a pattern that had shaped my entire life, and I had done it one quiet decision at a time. I stayed on the balcony until the sky darkened, then stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. The loft was peaceful, carrying the soft promise of the days ahead. I turned off the lights, letting the moonlight provide enough to guide me through the room. Before heading to bed, I paused with my hand resting on the back of the couch. I thought about the years I had spent trying to keep everyone afloat, the moments I had pushed aside my own needs, the countless times I said yes without thinking. And then I thought about the simple truth that had emerged as all of this unfolded. Some relationships only feel like love when you're giving more than you can afford. And stepping away doesn't mean failure. Sometimes it's the first act of real care you offer yourself. I settled into bed with that thought and let the quiet wrap around me. The next morning would arrive with its own rhythm, and I would meet it from a place I had never stood before, on my own terms, with my own purpose, and with a life finally shaped by the person I had always been beneath the weight of responsibility. If you've ever walked away from something that asked too much of you, or you've learned to see your worth beyond what you provide, I hope my story speaks to you. And if you're listening tonight, let me know where you're tuning in from, and feel free to subscribe or share your own experience in the comments below.